The photograph on my dresser shows two little girls in matching yellow sundresses, arms wrapped around each other, gap-toothed grins facing the camera. One of those girls grew up to plan the wedding of her dreams. The other grew up to be deliberately excluded from it. What happened next involved 37 Marines, a church parking lot in small-town Georgia, and a moment that changed everything between my sister and me forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Rachel Winters, and for the first 18 years of my life, my sister Emma was my best friend. We shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about our future weddings where we'd be each other's maid of honor. Emma was 2 years younger, but she always seemed more put together than me, more focused on what she wanted from life. While I was figuring out my path, she had already mapped out hers: college, career in marketing, marriage to her high school sweetheart Jake Morrison, and a house with a white picket fence in our hometown of Cedar Falls, Georgia. I took a different route. 3 months after graduating high school, I walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station in downtown Atlanta. The decision shocked everyone, especially Emma. She cried when I told her, begging me to reconsider, to go to college instead like we'd always planned. But something inside me needed to serve, needed to prove I could do something that mattered on a bigger scale than our small town could offer. Boot camp at Parris Island was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The physical challenges pushed me beyond limits I didn't know I had, but the mental transformation was even more profound. I learned discipline, leadership, and what it meant to be part of something larger than myself. When I graduated, Emma flew down with our parents for the ceremony. She seemed proud but distant, like she was looking at a stranger wearing her sister's face. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 8 months later. Emma was a junior in college by then, majoring in business and planning her engagement to Jake. We tried to stay close through video calls and messages, but the time difference and the intensity of military life made it challenging. I was living in a world she couldn't understand. Convoy runs through hostile territory, working with Afghan civilians to build schools and infrastructure, sleeping in bunkers when mortars hit our base. Meanwhile, she was worried about midterm exams and sorority events. The distance between us wasn't just geographical. When I came home on leave, I could see how my family looked at me differently. I carried myself straighter, spoke more directly, had less patience for small-town drama. Emma seemed uncomfortable around this new version of me, and I felt like an outsider in conversations about local gossip and college social life that once would have fascinated me. During my second deployment, Emma got engaged. She sent me a photo of the ring, a classic solitaire diamond that Jake had saved for months to buy. I was genuinely happy for her, but when we video called to celebrate, the conversation felt stilted. She talked about wedding venues and dress shopping, while I sat in a dusty forward operating base wearing combat fatigues, trying to relate to concerns about flower arrangements and catering options. The wedding planning process highlighted our growing divide. Emma wanted a traditional ceremony at Cedar Falls Methodist Church, the same place our parents had married. She envisioned bridesmaids in blush pink, a reception at the country club, and all the hometown touches that made our community special. I supported her choices, but I could tell she was uncomfortable when I mentioned I might not be able to get leave for the ceremony. That discomfort turned into something else when I came home for Christmas during her engagement year. I'd been promoted to corporal and had recently completed advanced combat training. The confidence and directness that military service had instilled in me seemed to make Emma nervous. At family gatherings, she'd steer conversations away from my experiences overseas, changing the subject when relatives asked about my service. The breaking point came during a conversation about her bachelorette party. Emma was planning a weekend in Savannah with her college friends and sorority sisters. When I asked about details, she hesitated before admitting she hadn't included me in the plans. She claimed it was because she wasn't sure about my leave schedule, but I could tell there was more to it. Her college friends saw me as the serious military sister who didn't fit their party atmosphere. Our relationship grew more strained as the wedding approached. Emma's calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, she seemed to edit herself, avoiding topics that might lead to discussions about my military life. I tried to bridge the gap by showing interest in wedding details, offering to help with planning despite being stationed across the country, but she politely declined most of my suggestions. The final blow came 6 weeks before the wedding. I was at Camp Pendleton, preparing for another deployment, when I received an email from Emma. Not a phone call, not a video chat, an email. She wrote that she'd been thinking carefully about the wedding party and had decided to keep it small. Just her college roommate as maid of honor, and Jake's sister as a bridesmaid. She didn't directly uninvite me, but the message was clear. I wasn't part of her vision for her special day. I stared at that email for hours, reading between the lines. Emma was embarrassed by who I'd become. The sister who'd once been her closest confidant was now too different, too intense, too much of a reminder that life could take you far from the comfortable predictability of Cedar Falls. She wanted a wedding that celebrated the life she'd chosen, surrounded by people who fit that narrative. A Marine sister who'd served in combat zones didn't match the aesthetic she was creating. The hurt was deeper than anything I'd experienced, including the worst days of deployment. Emma wasn't just excluding me from her wedding party, she was rejecting the person I'd chosen to become. All the growth, the service, the sacrifices I'd made in the name of something larger than myself meant nothing to the person whose opinion mattered most. I didn't respond to the email immediately. Instead, I threw myself into training, using physical exhaustion to numb the emotional pain. My fellow Marines noticed the change in my mood, but military culture doesn't encourage dwelling on personal problems. We were preparing for deployment. Focus had to remain on the mission and keeping each other safe. 2 weeks later, Emma called. She'd gotten engaged to Jake at the same spot where we used to play as children, the old oak tree by Miller's Creek. She was excited, chattering about ring sizes and venue bookings, but there was something forced about her enthusiasm. When I didn't match her energy, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, congratulated her, and kept my feelings about the wedding party situation to myself. But I wasn't fine. The sister who'd once promised we'd always be there for each other's biggest moments had decided I was no longer welcome at hers. The little girl in the yellow sundress who'd wrapped her arms around me in that photograph had grown into someone who saw my service as something to be hidden rather than celebrated. As Emma's wedding day approached, I prepared for my upcoming deployment to Iraq, knowing I'd be thousands of miles away when my sister walked down the aisle. I told myself it was better this way. I could focus on my duties without the distraction of family drama. But late at night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I grieved for the relationship Emma and I had lost and wondered if we'd ever find our way back to each other. 3 weeks before Emma's wedding, my deployment to Iraq was suddenly postponed due to equipment delays. The news should have been a relief, but instead it created an unexpected problem. I now had leave time during Emma's wedding weekend, and my family knew it. My mother called within hours of finding out about the deployment delay. Patricia Winters had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and insisted we could work through anything. Her voice carried that familiar tone of forced optimism as she suggested I could still attend the wedding, maybe even participate somehow. Emma's been under so much stress with the planning, Mom explained, though I could hear the careful way she chose her words. I think she'd be happy to have you there, sweetie. Maybe you could do a reading during the ceremony. The offer felt like a consolation prize. After years of planning to be Emma's maid of honor, I was being offered a minor speaking role, like a distant relative they felt obligated to include. I told Mom I'd think about it, but we both knew I wouldn't accept the charity invitation. My father had a different approach when he called later that week. Thomas Winters was a man of few words, a former factory supervisor who believed in direct communication. He didn't dance around the issue like Mom had. "Your sister made a mistake, Rachel," he said bluntly, "but she's young and scared. This wedding has gotten bigger than what she can handle, and she's making decisions based on what other people think instead of what's right." Dad's words carried weight because he rarely offered opinions on family dynamics. He was the type of man who fixed problems with actions rather than discussions. But even he seemed uncertain about how to repair the damage between Emma and me. I spent those 3 weeks in a strange limbo. My unit was in pre-deployment mode but stuck stateside, which meant intensive training days followed by evenings, with nothing to distract me from thoughts of Emma's approaching wedding. My fellow Marines knew something was bothering me, but military culture doesn't encourage dwelling on personal issues. Staff Sergeant Martinez, my team leader, finally pulled me aside after noticing my distraction during a combat readiness exercise. Carlos Martinez was a career Marine from El Paso, Texas, who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had a reputation for looking out for his people. "Winters, you've been off your game for 2 weeks," he said after dismissing the rest of the squad. "Whatever's eating at you, fix it or compartmentalize it. We can't afford distracted Marines when we deploy." I found myself telling him about Emma's wedding, about feeling like an outsider in my own family. Martinez listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as I explained the growing distance between my sister and me. "Family's complicated," he said finally. "But here's what I've learned in 15 years of service. The people who matter will respect what you've chosen to do with your life. The ones who don't respect it aren't the people you thought they were." His words struck deeper than I expected. Emma wasn't just excluding me from her wedding. She was rejecting the core of who I'd become. The values that military service had instilled in me, honor, courage, commitment, apparently embarrassed her enough to hide me from her new life. 2 days before the wedding, I made a decision that surprised even me. I requested weekend leave and booked a flight to Atlanta. I wasn't going to attend the ceremony, but I wanted to be close to home, to see if being in Cedar Falls might provide some clarity about my relationship with Emma. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I rented a small room at the Hampton Inn on the outskirts of town, about 10 miles from the church where Emma would be married. The plan was simple: stay hidden, avoid any wedding-related locations, and use the time to think about whether our relationship could be salvaged. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Georgia spring weather that couldn't decide between winter and summer. I drove aimlessly through the back roads of Cedar Falls, passing familiar landmarks that felt like artifacts from someone else's childhood. The old swimming hole where Emma and I had spent summer afternoons. The ice cream shop where we'd celebrated every birthday and minor achievement. The high school where I'd first started thinking about military service. Around noon, I found myself at Miller's Creek, the spot where Emma and Jake had gotten engaged. The old oak tree looked exactly the same, its massive branches creating a canopy over the weathered picnic table where our family had held countless gatherings. I sat there for an hour, remembering the little girls who'd carved their initials in that bark, promising to be best friends forever. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Beautiful day for a wedding after all." The sun came out just as Emma started getting ready. She'd attached a photo of Emma in her wedding dress, radiant and glowing, surrounded by her bridesmaids in their blush pink gowns. I stared at that image for a long time, noting how happy Emma looked, how perfectly everything had come together for her special day. At 2:30 p.m., I drove past Cedar Falls Methodist Church. Cars were already arriving, wedding guests in their Sunday best walking toward the entrance decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. I recognized many faces: high school classmates, family friends, relatives I hadn't seen in years. This was Emma's community, the world she'd chosen to embrace while I'd chosen something entirely different. I parked across the street, far enough away to avoid being noticed but close enough to see the activity. Part of me hoped Emma might step outside, that we might have an unexpected moment to reconcile before her ceremony began. But that was a fantasy born from too many romantic movies. Real life doesn't provide convenient moments of redemption. At 3:15 p.m., the wedding party began arriving. I watched Jake and his groomsmen pose for photos on the church steps, all of them looking nervous and excited. Then came the bridesmaids, elegant in their matching dresses, laughing and adjusting each other's hair and makeup. Emma's college roommate Sarah Chen was clearly the maid of honor, carrying the distinctive larger bouquet and coordinating the group's movements. Finally, at 3:45 p.m., Emma arrived. She looked stunning in a classic A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves, her dark hair swept into an elegant updo adorned with small white flowers. Our parents flanked her as she emerged from the bridal car, Dad offering his arm while Mom fussed with the train of Emma's dress. Watching that scene, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in how beautiful and happy Emma looked, sadness that I wasn't part of this moment that we'd dreamed about since childhood, and underneath it all, a growing sense of acceptance that Emma and I had become different people who wanted different things from life. The church bells began ringing at 4 p.m., signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests filed inside, the heavy wooden doors closing behind them. I sat in my rental car, listening to those bells and thinking about the vows Emma and Jake were exchanging, the promises they were making to build a life together in the town where we'd grown up. I was about to drive away when I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A convoy of military vehicles was approaching on the main road, 3 Humvees with Marine Corps markings, heading toward the church. The Marine convoy pulled into the church parking lot with military precision, 3 Humvees forming a neat line near the back entrance. I watched in confusion as uniformed Marines began emerging from the vehicles. These weren't just any Marines. I recognized the distinctive red and gold cord of dress blues on several of them, indicating this was some kind of formal detail. My heart pounded as I tried to understand what was happening. Had something gone wrong with my deployment? Was this some kind of emergency notification that required tracking me down at my sister's wedding location? The possibilities racing through my mind were all variations of worst-case scenarios. The lead Marine, a gunnery sergeant I didn't recognize, began organizing the others into formation. I counted 37 Marines total, a significant number for any kind of detail. They moved with the crisp efficiency that comes from extensive training, but there was something almost ceremonial about their positioning. Unable to contain my curiosity and growing concern, I got out of my rental car and approached the group. Several Marines noticed me immediately, and I saw recognition flash across their faces. Word travels fast in the Corps, especially when it involves one of your own. "Excuse me, Gunnery Sergeant," I called out, using proper protocol despite being out of uniform myself. "I'm Corporal Rachel Winters. Is there something I should know about?" Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez turned toward me with a smile that immediately eased my fears about emergency notifications. Miguel Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough combat to appreciate life's gentler moments. "Corporal Winters," he said, extending his hand, "we've been looking for you. Staff Sergeant Martinez thought you might be in the area today." The mention of Martinez's name added another layer of confusion. How had my team leader known I was in Cedar Falls? I'd only mentioned Emma's wedding in passing during our conversation about my distracted behavior. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand what's happening here," I admitted. Rodriguez's smile widened. "Martinez told us about your situation, about your sister's wedding and how you weren't included in the ceremony. He also mentioned that you've been struggling with feeling disconnected from your family since joining the Corps." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. The idea that my personal problems had been discussed among Marines I didn't know was mortifying. Military culture values stoicism and self-reliance, and here I was being treated like a charity case. "With respect, Gunnery Sergeant, I didn't ask for any kind of intervention," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "No, you didn't," Rodriguez agreed. "But that's what Marines do for each other. We show up when it matters, whether you ask for it or not." Before I could respond, another familiar voice called my name. I turned to see Sergeant David Kim approaching from the 2nd Humvee. Kim had been in my unit during my first deployment to Afghanistan, and we'd developed the kind of friendship that comes from shared danger and mutual trust. "Winters!" "I couldn't believe it when Martinez put out the word about what was happening today," Kim said, clasping my shoulder in the informal greeting common among combat veterans. "There was no way we were letting you go through this alone." "David, what are you even doing here? Aren't you stationed at Quantico now?" I asked, still struggling to process the situation. "Took emergency leave," he said simply. "When Martinez sent word through the network about a Marine sister who needed support, it didn't matter where we were stationed. We came." The network Kim referred to was the informal communication system that connects Marines across different units and bases. It's how information travels, how favors get called in, and how Marines take care of their own when official channels aren't sufficient. As Kim explained the situation, I began to understand the scope of what had happened. Martinez hadn't just mentioned my problem to a few local Marines. He'd reached out through his contacts across multiple bases, sharing the story of a Marine whose family had rejected her service. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Marines from Camp Lejeune, Quantico, Camp Pendleton, and even a few from nearby Army installations had coordinated leave time to travel to Cedar Falls. They'd driven through the night, taken emergency flights, and rearranged personal commitments to be here for someone most of them had never met. But why? I asked, genuinely bewildered by the gesture. You don't even know me. Sergeant Lisa Thompson stepped forward from the group. I recognized her insignia as a combat engineer, someone who'd likely served in some of the same dangerous areas I had. Her expression was serious but warm. Because you're one of us, Thompson said simply. Because you chose to serve your country, and that choice has value whether your family recognizes it or not. Because sometimes civilians don't understand what military service means, and when that happens, we remind them. The weight of what these Marines were offering began to sink in. They weren't here to cause drama or disrupt Emma's wedding. They were here to provide something I'd been missing: recognition and respect for the path I'd chosen. Martinez told us you weren't invited to be in the wedding party, Rodriguez explained. He said your sister was embarrassed by your military service, like it was something to be hidden rather than celebrated. Hearing my situation described so directly was painful but also clarifying. These Marines saw the rejection I'd experienced, not as a personal failing on my part, but as a failure of understanding on Emma's part. We can't make your sister appreciate your service, Thompson continued, but we can make sure that when you look back on this day, you remember that 37 Marines thought your service was worth celebrating. The church bells chimed 4:30 p.m., indicating that Emma's ceremony was halfway complete. Inside those walls, my sister was promising to love and honor Jake for the rest of their lives, surrounded by the people she'd chosen to witness that commitment. Outside, a group of strangers who'd become family were preparing to honor the commitment I'd made to something larger than myself. What exactly are you planning to do? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. When the ceremony ends and the wedding party comes out for photos, we're going to form an honor guard, Rodriguez explained. 37 Marines in dress blues, creating a salute line for Corporal Rachel Winters. Not because we want to overshadow your sister's day, but because we want to make sure your service is acknowledged in the place where you grew up. The plan was both simple and profound. As Emma and Jake emerged from the church as newlyweds, they would see a powerful reminder that one of their family members had chosen a path of service that commanded respect from people who understood its true value. I looked at the faces surrounding me, Marines from different units, different backgrounds, different stages of their careers, all united by the common bond of service and the shared belief that no Marine should face rejection alone. Some were barely out of boot camp, others were seasoned veterans with multiple deployments. What they had in common was an understanding of sacrifice, commitment, and the importance of having your choices honored by the people who matter. I don't know what to say, I admitted, feeling emotion rise in my throat. You don't have to say anything, Kim replied. Just let us do this for you. Let us show your family and your hometown what it means to be a Marine. The next 20 minutes felt like the longest of my life. I stood with 37 Marines in the church parking lot, watching them transform from individual service members into a precision formation that would have impressed any drill instructor. The efficiency with which they organized themselves spoke to years of training and shared understanding of military protocol. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez positioned himself at the head of the formation, with Marines arranged in order of rank and seniority. Those in dress blues took the front positions, their uniforms immaculate despite the travel required to reach Cedar Falls. Marines in service uniforms filled the rear ranks, creating an impressive display of military bearing that would be visible from anywhere on the church grounds. As they prepared, I learned more about how this extraordinary gathering had come together. Sergeant Kim explained that Martinez had reached out to his former drill instructor, now stationed at Parris Island, who had connections throughout the Southeast Marine Network. Within 48 hours, word had spread across multiple bases about a Marine whose family had rejected her service. You'd be amazed how fast information travels when it's about taking care of our own, said Corporal Jennifer Walsh, a logistics specialist from Camp Lejeune who'd driven 8 hours to be here. Martinez didn't have to ask twice. When Marines hear about one of us being treated like her service doesn't matter, we respond. The personal stories emerged as we waited. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had missed his nephew's birthday party to be here, but considered it a worthy sacrifice. My family understands what the uniform means, he explained. If they didn't, I'd want my Marine brothers and sisters to show up for me too. Lance Corporal Ashley Brooks, barely 21 and fresh from her first deployment, had used her savings to buy a last-minute plane ticket from California. "I don't have much family," she said quietly. "The Corps is my family. When someone attacks one of us by dismissing our service, they're attacking all of us." Their stories revealed a common thread: Marines who understood the weight of the commitment we'd all made, who recognized that military service often creates distance from civilian family members, and who refused to let that distance go unacknowledged. They weren't here to cause trouble or embarrass Emma. They were here to ensure that my choice to serve was treated with the respect it deserved. At 4:50 p.m., the church bells chimed again, signaling that the ceremony was nearing its end. Rodriguez gave a sharp command, and the Marines snapped into formation with the synchronized precision that only comes from extensive military training. The sight was breathtaking: 37 service members arranged in perfect lines, their bearing radiating the confidence and discipline that defined military culture. "Corporal Winters," Rodriguez called out, "please take your position at the head of the formation." I hesitated, suddenly aware of what was about to happen. In minutes, Emma would emerge from the church as a new bride, expecting to see typical wedding guests ready to shower her with rice and congratulations. Instead, she would encounter a formal military honor guard that existed solely to recognize the sister she'd chosen to exclude from her special day. "Sir, maybe this isn't the right approach," I said, my voice betraying the uncertainty I felt. "I don't want to ruin Emma's wedding day or cause a scene that she'll regret forever." Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, her expression understanding but firm. "Winters, your sister made a choice to exclude you because she was embarrassed by your service. That choice had consequences, and one of those consequences is that 37 Marines now know how she treated a fellow service member." "We're not here to ruin anything," added Kim. "We're here to make sure that when people in this town think about this wedding, they also remember that Corporal Rachel Winters serves her country with honor. Your sister can have her perfect day, but she can't erase the fact that you've earned respect through your service." The church doors opened at exactly 5 p.m. Emma and Jake appeared first, radiant with happiness, followed by their wedding party and families. The photographer immediately began directing them toward the front steps for traditional post-ceremony photos, while guests spilled out onto the lawn, chatting excitedly about the beautiful ceremony they'd just witnessed. Emma looked stunning in her wedding gown, her face glowing with the joy that comes from marrying your best friend surrounded by everyone you love most. She laughed at something Jake whispered in her ear, then turned to pose for photos with her bridesmaids, completely unaware of what was happening in the parking lot behind her. My parents emerged with the rest of the family members, Mom dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while Dad straightened his tie with the satisfaction of a father who'd successfully walked his daughter down the aisle. They joined the growing crowd of guests who were beginning to notice the unusual activity near the parking area. "Formation!" Rodriguez commanded in the sharp tone that had been drilled into every Marine since boot camp. 37 Marines snapped to attention simultaneously, the sound of their synchronized movement audible across the church grounds. Conversations stopped as wedding guests turned to see what was happening. Camera flashes began popping as people reached for their phones to capture the unexpected sight. Emma noticed the commotion and turned away from her photographer, her smile fading as she registered the presence of so many uniformed service members. Her eyes searched the formation until they found me standing at its head, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to recognition to something I couldn't quite identify. "Present arms!" Rodriguez shouted. 37 Marines executed a perfect salute, their movements so synchronized they seemed like a single organism. The sight was powerful enough to make several wedding guests gasp audibly. This wasn't a casual gesture or a spontaneous demonstration. This was a formal military honor, typically reserved for fallen heroes and visiting dignitaries. The silence that followed was complete. Even the children in the wedding party stopped their chatter as they stared at the impressive display of military precision. Emma stood frozen on the church steps, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands as she processed what she was seeing. Jake moved protectively closer to his new wife, clearly uncertain about how to respond to this unexpected development. The wedding photographer continued taking pictures, recognizing that whatever was happening would be an important part of this day's story. My father was the first family member to move. Thomas Winters walked slowly across the parking lot, his expression unreadable as he approached the formation. When he reached me, he stopped and looked at the Marines surrounding his daughter. "Gentlemen," he said in the quiet voice he used when he was trying to control strong emotion, "thank you for coming here today." Then he did something that surprised everyone, including me. My father, who had never served in the military himself, snapped his hand to his forehead in an approximation of a military salute. It wasn't technically correct. His form was imperfect and his timing was off, but the respect it conveyed was unmistakable. Mom followed him across the parking lot, tears streaming down her face as she realized what these Marines were doing for her daughter. She didn't attempt a salute, but she placed her hand over her heart and mouthed the words, "Thank you," to the formation. The moment stretched on, 37 Marines holding their salute while my parents stood beside me, finally witnessing the respect that military service commanded from people who understood its true value. Emma remained on the church steps, surrounded by her wedding party and guests, forced to confront the reality that her sister's life had meaning and importance beyond the boundaries of Cedar Falls, Georgia. The salute held for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. In that span of time, I watched Emma's face cycle through emotions I'd never seen from her before. Shock, confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been realization. Her perfect wedding day had suddenly become something much more complicated. "Order arms!" Rodriguez commanded, and 37 hands dropped simultaneously to their sides. The Marines maintained their rigid attention, waiting for whatever would happen next. Emma took a tentative step down from the church steps, then another, until she was walking across the parking lot toward me. Jake followed close behind, his protective instincts clearly activated by this unexpected turn of events. The wedding party and guests trailed after them, creating a crowd of formally dressed civilians facing off against a formation of Marines. When Emma reached the edge of the formation, she stopped. Her wedding dress was beautiful but impractical for walking across asphalt, and she had to gather the fabric carefully to avoid tripping. Up close, I could see that her perfectly applied makeup was starting to show signs of stress, her lipstick slightly smudged, her mascara threatening to run. "Rachel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what is this?" I looked at my sister, this woman who had once been my closest friend and confidant, who now stood before me in her dream wedding dress, surrounded by the life she'd carefully constructed. For the first time in months, I didn't feel angry or hurt. Instead, I felt sad for both of us, for the relationship we'd lost and the distance that had grown between us. "These are my fellow Marines," I said simply. "They came here to honor my service because they felt it deserved recognition." Emma's eyes moved across the formation, taking in the faces of men and women who had traveled hundreds of miles to support someone they'd never met. Some were barely older than she was. Others were seasoned veterans with decades of experience. What they all shared was an unwavering commitment to the values that military service represented. "But why here?" Emma asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why at my wedding?" Before I could answer, Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward. His voice was respectful but firm as he addressed my sister directly. "Ma'am, we're here because your sister has served 2 combat deployments in defense of this country. She's earned the respect that comes with that service, and when we learned that her own family didn't recognize the value of what she's done, we felt compelled to ensure that recognition happened." Emma flinched as if she'd been slapped. The direct nature of Rodriguez's words cut through any pretense about why the Marines were there. This wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate response to her treatment of me. "I never said I didn't respect Rachel's service," Emma protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "You excluded her from your wedding party," Sergeant Thompson said, stepping forward to join Rodriguez. "You made her feel like her military service was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. In the Marine Corps, we call that failing to honor a fellow service member." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her wedding guests who were starting to understand what had happened, parents who were seeing their family dynamics exposed in public, Marines who were waiting to see how she would respond to this confrontation. Jake finally spoke up, his voice tight with the stress of trying to protect his new wife while navigating a situation he didn't fully understand. "Look, I'm sure there are good people here, but this is our wedding day. Can't this conversation happen some other time?" The question seemed reasonable, but it missed the point entirely. Staff Sergeant Torres, the Marine who had missed his nephew's birthday to be here, responded with the patience of someone who had dealt with civilian misunderstanding of military culture many times before. "Sir, with respect, there won't be another time. Your wife chose to exclude her sister from this day because she was embarrassed by Corporal Winter's military service. We're here to make sure that when people remember this wedding, they also remember that Rachel Winters serves her country with honor." Emma's composure finally cracked. Tears began running down her cheeks, smearing her carefully applied makeup and leaving dark streaks on her white dress. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "It's not that I'm embarrassed by Rachel, it's that she became someone I don't recognize. She changed when she joined the Marines. She became distant and serious and different. I wanted my wedding to be about the people who are still part of my life, not about trying to include someone who chose to leave." The honesty of Emma's admissions surprised everyone, including me. For the first time, she was articulating her real feelings instead of hiding behind excuses about wedding party size or scheduling conflicts. "I didn't leave," I said quietly. "I grew up. I found something worth dedicating my life to, something bigger than this town and the things we used to think were important. That doesn't mean I stopped loving you, Emma. It means I became someone who could protect the life you wanted to live." Emma looked at me with fresh tears in her eyes, perhaps beginning to understand the connection between my service and her ability to have the safe, predictable life she'd chosen. Sergeant Kim stepped forward, his voice gentle but clear. "Ma'am, your sister has spent years in dangerous places, doing difficult jobs so that people like you can have weddings like this without worrying about whether your church will be bombed or your guests will be safe. That service has value whether you recognize it or not." The crowd of wedding guests had grown quiet, absorbing this unexpected lesson about military sacrifice and family dynamics. Some were recording with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. Others simply watched, trying to process the complex emotions playing out before them. My mother chose that moment to approach Emma, her own tears flowing freely as she placed a gentle hand on her younger daughter's shoulder. "Sweetheart," Mom said softly, "Rachel has been protecting people like us while we've been planning this wedding. Maybe it's time we acknowledged what that means." Emma looked at our mother, then at me, then at the Marines, who had traveled so far to ensure my service was honored. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition that she had been seeing my military career as abandonment rather than commitment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible over the breeze that was starting to pick up. "I'm sorry I made you feel like your service didn't matter. I'm sorry I excluded you from today. I was scared that including you would remind everyone that there's a dangerous world outside Cedar Falls. And I wanted to pretend that world didn't exist." The apology was more honest than anything Emma had said to me in years. It acknowledged not just her actions, but the fear that had motivated them. The desire to live in a bubble where military service and sacrifice were abstract concepts rather than personal realities. I stepped forward and took my sister's hands, careful not to wrinkle her wedding dress. The Marines maintained their formation behind me, a reminder that I had found a new family in the Corps, but I was still Emma's sister. "I forgive you," I said simply. "But I need you to understand that this is who I am now. I'm still your sister, but I'm also a Marine. Both of those things matter." Emma nodded, fresh tears mixing with the ones already staining her cheeks. For the first time in years, she looked at me and seemed to see both versions, the sister she remembered and the woman I had become. Rodriguez gave a final command, "Marines, present arms." This time the salute was different. It wasn't a demonstration or a confrontation. It was a genuine honor, offered to a service member whose family had finally recognized the value of her commitment. Emma watched with new understanding as 37 Marines acknowledged the sister she had almost lost to her own fear and misunderstanding. When the salute ended and the Marines began to disperse, Emma hugged me for the first time in over a year. Her wedding dress would need cleaning and her makeup required touching up, but something more important had been repaired that day than cosmetic damage. The aftermath of the Marine salute created an unusual pause in the wedding festivities. Guests stood in clusters, some wiping away tears, others quietly discussing what they'd just witnessed. The photographer, clearly recognizing the historical significance of the moment, had captured the entire exchange between Emma and me, the reconciliation hug, and the final salute. As the Marines began to fall out of formation, something unexpected happened. The wedding guests started approaching them, not with suspicion or resentment, but with genuine curiosity and respect. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught both Emma and me in elementary school, walked up to Sergeant Kim and thanked him for his service. Mr. Patterson, who owned the local hardware store, struck up a conversation with Staff Sergeant Torres about his deployment experiences. "I never really understood what military service meant until today," said Jessica Chen, Emma's maid of honor, as she approached me. "Watching those Marines come here just to honor you, it made me realize how much sacrifice goes into protecting the rest of us." Emma overheard Jessica's comment and nodded slowly. "I think I've been living in a bubble," she admitted. "I wanted my wedding to be perfect and safe and predictable, and somehow I convinced myself that including Rachel would bring too much reality into my fairy tale." The conversation was interrupted by Jake, who had been talking quietly with his groomsmen about how to proceed with the reception. As the groom, he felt responsible for ensuring the day continued smoothly despite the emotional disruption. "Emma," he said gently, placing a protective arm around his new wife's shoulders, "the photographer wants to know if we should continue with the planned photos or if we want to include this situation in the official wedding pictures." It was a diplomatic way of asking whether Emma wanted to acknowledge what had happened or pretend it hadn't occurred. The question forced Emma to make a choice about how she wanted to remember this day and what story she wanted to tell about her relationship with me. Emma looked at me, then at the Marines who were still mingling with wedding guests, sharing stories and answering questions about military life. Some of her anxiety seemed to fade as she watched her community engage respectfully with these service members who had traveled so far to support her sister. "I want Rachel in the family photos," Emma said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "If these Marines think her service is worth celebrating, then maybe it's time our family celebrated it too." The decision created a ripple effect through the wedding party. Sarah Chen immediately offered to share maid of honor duties for the photos, insisting that I should stand beside Emma where I belonged. Jake's sister Rebecca suggested that some of the Marines join the group photos as honorary groomsmen, an idea that was quickly embraced by the other wedding party members. What followed was unlike any wedding photo session I'd ever seen. Traditional family groupings were mixed with images that included Marines in dress blues, standing alongside bridesmaids in blush pink. Formal military protocol photos were interspersed with casual shots of wedding guests, learning about military traditions from active duty service members. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez declined to be in the formal photos, explaining that this was Emma and Jake's day, but he agreed to a few informal shots that captured the unique nature of what had transpired. The image that would later become my favorite showed Emma and me standing together, surrounded by both her wedding party and my Marine family, all of us laughing at something Jake had said to break the tension. As the photo session continued, I found myself in conversations I'd never expected to have. Emma's college friends asked detailed questions about military training and deployment experiences. Relatives who had seemed uncomfortable with my service before were suddenly interested in understanding what my job actually involved. Uncle Robert, Dad's brother who had always been skeptical of my military career, approached me with unexpected humility. "Rachel, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've been thinking of your service as something that took you away from the family. Today I realized it's something that protects the family." The sentiment was echoed by other family members throughout the afternoon. Emma's transformation seemed to give others permission to express respect and curiosity about military life that they'd previously kept hidden. The Marines, in turn, were gracious ambassadors for military culture. patiently explaining traditions and answering questions from civilians who rarely had opportunities to interact with active duty service members. As the reception moved to the country club, the celebration took on a different character than Emma had originally planned. Tables were rearranged to accommodate the Marines who had been invited to stay for dinner. The DJ added military anthems to his playlist at the request of several guests. What had begun as a traditional Southern wedding had evolved into something more complex and meaningful. During the dinner, Emma surprised everyone by asking for the microphone during the traditional toast segment. She stood up in her wedding dress, now slightly wrinkled and marked with tears, and addressed the assembled crowd. "Most of you know that my sister Rachel serves in the Marine Corps," Emma began, her voice carrying across the room. "What you might not know is that I've been treating her service like something to be ashamed of, instead of something to be proud of. Today, 37 Marines traveled from across the country to remind me that Rachel's commitment to serving others is worthy of respect and celebration." Emma paused, looking directly at me across the room. "Rachel, I'm sorry it took a dramatic intervention for me to see what everyone else already knew, that you're a hero, not just to strangers in distant countries, but to your family here at home. I'm proud to be your sister, and I'm grateful for the sacrifices you've made to keep all of us safe." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt. Marines and civilians stood together, applauding not just Emma's words but the healing that had taken place between us. I felt tears streaming down my face as I realized that the day I dreaded had become one of the most meaningful of my life. Sergeant Thompson leaned over to whisper in my ear, "That's what we came here for, Winters. Not to embarrass your sister, but to help her understand what she almost threw away." As the evening progressed, the integration of military and civilian guests created unexpected moments of connection. Lance Corporal Brooks taught Emma's grandmother how to properly fold an American flag. Staff Sergeant Martinez shared deployment stories with Jake's father, who had always wondered what military service involved but never felt comfortable asking. The wedding cake cutting took on special significance when Emma insisted that I help her with the traditional first slice. The photographer captured the moment when Emma fed Jake cake, then turned to offer me a bite as well. A gesture that acknowledged my place in the family despite the years of distance that had grown between us. Late in the evening, as the reception wound down and guests began to leave, the Marines prepared for their various journeys home. They had accomplished what they came to do, ensuring that my service was recognized and valued by the family that had once rejected it. Rodriguez approached me one final time before departing. "Winters, I hope you understand what happened here today. Your sister didn't reject your service because it wasn't valuable. She rejected it because she was scared of losing the person you used to be. Sometimes civilians need help understanding that military service doesn't take away from who we are, it adds to it." As the Marines said their goodbyes and headed back to their vehicles, Emma caught my arm. "Rachel, I know I can't undo the hurt I caused by excluding you from the wedding party. But I want you to know that from now on, your service will always be welcome in my life. Not hidden, not minimized, but celebrated." We hugged again, this time without the urgency of reconciliation, but with the quiet satisfaction of understanding finally achieved. Emma's wedding day had become something neither of us had planned. A bridge between two different ways of life, built by Marines who refused to let one of their own face family rejection alone. Hell, the drive back to my hotel that night gave me time to process everything that had happened. What had begun as one of the most painful days of my life had transformed into a powerful reminder of why I'd chosen military service in the first place: to protect the people and values that matter most, even when those people struggle to understand the sacrifice involved. The weeks following Emma's wedding brought changes to our family that no one could have anticipated. The story of 37 Marines traveling to honor a sister who had been excluded from a wedding party spread throughout Cedar Falls faster than summer wildfire. Local news stations picked up the story, then regional outlets, and eventually it reached national attention as an example of military families supporting their own. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Reporters called our house constantly, wanting interviews about family dynamics and military service. Emma handled most of the press inquiries, insisting that she wanted to tell the story herself, rather than letting others interpret what had happened. Her interviews were honest about her mistakes, and clear about the lessons she'd learned. "I thought my sister's military service was something that made her different from us," Emma told a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "I didn't understand that her service was protecting our ability to be different, to live the safe, comfortable lives we wanted. Those Marines didn't come to my wedding to embarrass me. They came to educate me." The local Marine Corps recruiting station saw an unexpected surge in interest following the news coverage. Young people from Cedar Falls and surrounding communities began asking questions about military service, inspired by the story of Marines who traveled across the country to support one of their own. Staff Sergeant Williams, the local recruiter, told me later that he'd never seen such genuine interest in understanding what military commitment actually meant. 3 weeks after the wedding, I returned to Cedar Falls for what had become a monthly tradition, Sunday dinner with my parents. These gatherings had always been somewhat tense since I'd joined the Marines, with careful conversations that avoided topics related to my military life. Now they had a completely different character. Emma and Jake had moved into a small house just 10 minutes from our parents' home, and they'd become regular attendees at these family dinners. The first time Emma asked me detailed questions about my deployment experiences, Mom started crying, not from sadness, but from relief that her daughters were finally talking openly about their lives. "Tell me about the school project you worked on in Afghanistan," Emma said during one of these dinners, referring to a construction project I'd mentioned in passing years earlier. "I want to understand what you actually did over there, not just the dangerous parts one was always worried about." These conversations revealed how much Emma had never known about my military service. She'd focused so intensely on the risks and the distance that she'd never asked about the meaningful work: building infrastructure, training local security forces, providing medical assistance to civilian populations. Learning about these aspects of my service helped her understand that military deployment involved much more than the combat operations that dominated news coverage. Jake proved to be unexpectedly interested in military culture and history. He began reading books about Marine Corps traditions and asking thoughtful questions about leadership development and team building. His genuine curiosity helped bridge the gap between my military life and my family's civilian world in ways that felt natural rather than forced. "I've been thinking about what that gunnery sergeant said at our wedding," Jake told me during one of our conversations, "about how your service protects our ability to live the lives we want. I never really connected those dots before, that someone has to be willing to do the dangerous jobs so the rest of us can do the safe ones." The transformation in family dynamics extended beyond just Emma and Jake. My parents began displaying photos of me in military uniform alongside the traditional family portraits that had always decorated their living room. Dad started attending local Veterans Day ceremonies, something he'd never done before, and Mom joined a support group for military families at our church. Uncle Robert, who had apologized to me at the wedding reception, became one of my strongest advocates in the extended family. He organized a care package drive for my unit before our next deployment, recruiting relatives who had previously seemed indifferent to my military service. The project brought together family members from across Georgia, all contributing items and letters for Marines they'd never met but now felt connected to through my service. The response from the Marines who had attended Emma's wedding was equally meaningful. Staff Sergeant Martinez called regularly to check on how my family relationships were developing. He was particularly interested in whether the intervention had achieved its intended goal of earning respect for my service without causing permanent damage to family bonds. "The Corps takes care of its own," Martinez reminded me during one of our conversations. "But that doesn't mean we ignore the civilian families that our Marines come from. We want your sister to understand your service, not resent it." Sounds like that's exactly what happened. Sergeant Kim sent periodic updates about his own family's reaction to the wedding story. His parents, who had immigrated from South Korea and initially struggled to understand his decision to join the Marines, had become vocal supporters of military families after seeing the news coverage. They'd started volunteering at a local veteran services organization, inspired by the example of Marines supporting each other across unit and geographic boundaries. The most surprising development came from Corporal Walsh, the logistics specialist who had driven 8 hours from Camp Lejeune to attend the wedding. She called to tell me that her own estranged brother had reached out after seeing the news story, wanting to rebuild their relationship that had been damaged by family conflicts over her military service. Your story helped my family understand that military service isn't about abandoning civilian life, Walsh explained. It's about protecting civilian life. My brother finally gets that my uniform doesn't separate me from the family. It connects me to something that keeps the family safe. These ripple effects reinforced the broader significance of what had happened at Emma's wedding. The Marines hadn't just intervened in one family conflict, they'd created a model for how military and civilian communities could better understand and support each other. 6 months after the wedding, Emma made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She applied for a job with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to military families. The position involved coordinating resources for spouses during deployments, organizing family readiness groups, and helping children understand their parents' military service. I spent so many years not understanding what military families go through, Emma explained when she told me about the job. Maybe I can help other families avoid the mistakes I made, help them see military service as something to be proud of, rather than something to fear. Emma's new career path created opportunities for us to work together in ways we'd never imagined. She often asked for my input on programs and services, wanting to ensure that her civilian perspective was informed by actual military experience. These collaborations helped heal the professional distance that had grown between us, while giving Emma meaningful work that connected to my service. The annual Marine Corps birthday celebration in November provided another opportunity for our family to demonstrate their new understanding of military culture. Emma and Jake attended the local celebration at the VFW Hall, joining Marines and their families for the traditional cake-cutting ceremony and commemoration of Corps history. Watching Emma participate in Marine traditions, asking respectful questions, and listening attentively to veteran stories felt like watching someone discover a world that had always existed but had been invisible to her. She took photos to share with her nonprofit colleagues, helping them understand the community they served. During the ceremony, when the traditional toast was offered to Marines serving overseas, Emma raised her glass with genuine emotion. "To my sister Rachel and all the Marines protecting our freedom," she said quietly, tears in her eyes as she thought about my upcoming deployment. The deployment that had been postponed the previous year was finally scheduled for the following spring. This time, the family's response was completely different. Instead of treating my departure as something to be endured, they organized it as something to be supported. Emma coordinated with my parents to create a comprehensive communication plan, ensuring regular video calls and care packages. She researched deployment support resources and connected with other military families to learn best practices for maintaining relationships across distance and time zones. Jake took responsibility for keeping extended family members informed about my deployment activities, creating a private social media group where I could share appropriate updates and photos. His project management skills, honed in his civilian career, proved valuable for organizing family support efforts. The night before my deployment, Emma hosted a send-off dinner at her house. She'd invited not just immediate family, but also several of the Marines who had attended her wedding and were able to travel to Cedar Falls. The gathering felt like a celebration rather than a farewell, with Marines and civilians sharing stories and offering encouragement for the mission ahead. "A year ago, I couldn't even talk about your military service without feeling anxious," Emma told me as we cleaned up after dinner. "Tonight, I feel proud and confident. Proud of what you're doing, and confident that our family finally understands how to support you properly." The transformation was complete when Emma asked if she could drive me to the airport for my departure flight. Previously, these goodbyes had been awkward and emotional, with Emma struggling to balance her fear for my safety with her desire to be supportive. This time felt different. At the airport, Emma hugged me with the confidence of someone who understood that deployment was a temporary separation, not an abandonment. She'd learned to see my service as an extension of our family's values rather than a rejection of them. "I'll be here when you get back," she promised. "And next time you come home, you won't have to wonder whether your family respects what you do for a living. We'll be ready to celebrate your service from the moment you step off the plane." The promise meant everything to me, because it represented complete acceptance of who I'd become. Emma wasn't tolerating my military career or trying to minimize its importance. She was embracing it as an integral part of our family's story. As my plane taxied toward the runway, I thought about the wedding day that had changed everything between Emma and me. 37 Marines had traveled from across the country to ensure that my service was recognized and respected. Their intervention had healed a family divide that might never have been repaired otherwise. But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated the values that military service represents: loyalty, commitment, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Emma had learned those lessons not through lectures or arguments, but through witnessing them in action. The little girls in the yellow sundresses who had promised to be best friends forever had grown into women who understood that friendship sometimes requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. Military service had changed me, but it had also changed Emma, helping her become someone who could appreciate sacrifice and understand commitment. 6 months into my deployment, I received a care package that perfectly captured how much our relationship had evolved. Along with the usual cookies and toiletries, Emma had included letters from local school children thanking Marines for their service, photographs from recent family gatherings, and a newspaper clipping about her nonprofit's latest program for military families. The package also contained a photo from her wedding day, not one of the traditional formal shots, but the candid image of us hugging after the Marine salute, surrounded by service members and family members who were all smiling despite their tears. On the back, Emma had written, "Thank you for showing me what honor looks like." That photograph sits on my bunk as I write this, a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful victories happen not on battlefields but in church parking lots, where Marines gather to ensure that service is recognized and families learn to understand sacrifice. The 37 Marines who traveled to Cedar Falls changed more than just one wedding day. They changed how an entire family understood the value of military service. And sometimes, that kind of change is exactly what the mission requires. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.